8 mice were placed inside what looked like paradise. 4 males, 4 females. They had endless food, endless water, clean bedding, warm temperatures, and no predators. No snakes, no cats, no hunger, no disease spreading through the cage, no outside danger of any kind. Everything a mouse needed to survive was already there, and then, less than 5 years later, every single mouse in that world was dead. But that is not the strange part. The strange part is that they did not die because the food ran out. They did not die because the water disappeared. They did not die because a predator entered the cage. They died inside a world designed to keep them alive. This place was called Universe 25. And for decades, people have looked at it as one of the most disturbing experiments ever performed on a society. But most people get the lesson wrong. They say the experiment proved that comfort destroys life. They say it proved that abundance makes societies weak. They say it showed what happens when living becomes too easy. But the real story is far stranger than that. Because the mice in Universe 25 did not collapse because they had too much comfort. They collapsed because their world ran out of something much harder to see: a reason to participate. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to 1968. That year, an American scientist named John B. Calhoun created a sealed world for mice inside a research facility in Maryland. Calhoun was not simply interested in mice. He was interested in societies. He wanted to understand what happens when a population grows inside a space where basic survival is no longer the main problem. What happens when hunger is removed? What happens when predators are removed? What happens when nature stops forcing animals to struggle? For years, Calhoun had been building experimental worlds, not one, not two, but dozens. He created enclosed habitats for rats and mice in forests, barns, laboratories, and carefully designed pens. Each one was a different version of the same question. If you give animals everything they need, will society become peaceful, or will something else break? Again and again, he saw a pattern. At first, the population grew. Then it grew faster. Then the space became crowded. Then the social order began to twist. Aggression appeared. Mating behavior changed. Mothers failed. Young animals grew up without stable roles. And eventually, the society collapsed. Universe 25 was meant to be the cleanest version of the experiment. The final version, the one where nobody could say the animals died because they were cold, hungry, sick, or neglected. Calhoun designed the enclosure like a miniature city. It was roughly 9 feet square, with walls lined by vertical living spaces. Small apartments were stacked upward, connected by mesh ramps and tunnels. There were food stations that never emptied, water bottles that never ran dry, nesting material placed where the mice could use it. The temperature stayed controlled. The enclosure was cleaned regularly. On paper, it could support thousands of mice. Some estimates suggested the space could hold around 3,800 animals without running out of basic resources. But Universe 25 would never come close to that number. On the first day, Calhoun placed the 8 original mice inside. Then he closed the world. For a while, nothing dramatic happened. The mice explored, they climbed, they learned the layout, they found places to sleep. They established small territories. For more than 3 months, the colony was almost quiet. Then the first babies arrived, and everything changed. The population began doubling roughly every 55 days. More mice meant more movement. More movement meant more contact. More contact meant more competition for the same social spaces. By day 315, there were already more than 600 mice inside. They moved across the ramps. They squeezed through tunnels. They slept in piles. They crowded around nesting areas. They stepped over each other just to reach places that were already full. But remember, the food was still there. The water was still there. The temperature was still perfect. From the outside, this should have been success. A growing colony, healthy bodies, no shortage. But this is where the experiment becomes disturbing. In a natural mouse population, when young males cannot find a place, they leave. They move away. They search for new territory. They create new roles somewhere else. But inside Universe 25, there was nowhere to go. No forest beyond the wall, no empty field, no second colony, no escape. The world was complete, and that was the problem. Young males who could not win territory began drifting into the center of the enclosure. They gathered there in strange, inactive groups. They did not build nests. They did not defend families. They did not court females normally. They simply existed. Calhoun watched them for hours. Many of them looked physically fine. They were fed. They were alive. But socially, they had no function. And when another mouse attacked them, some did almost nothing. They did not defend themselves in a normal way. They accepted the damage. Then they moved a short distance and returned to doing nothing. But that was only one side of the collapse. Other males reacted in the opposite way. They became frantic, restless, hyperactive. They moved through the enclosure constantly, invading spaces, disturbing nests, and forcing interactions that did not follow normal mouse behavior. The normal rituals that controlled aggression and mating began to disappear. The social signals that usually tell animals when to stop were no longer working. Some males became violent without purpose. Others became sexually chaotic. And in the most crowded areas, the colony began producing behavior that no healthy mouse society should produce. Then the females began to change too. Some retreated upward into the highest nesting boxes. They avoided males. They avoided contact. They stopped reproducing. They became isolated in the very world that was supposed to protect them. And this is where Calhoun noticed something he called a behavioral sink. Even though food was available in many places, the mice did not spread out evenly. Instead, they crowded around certain feeding areas. They seemed to prefer eating where other mice were already gathered. An empty food station, even if it was full, became strangely unattractive. The animals were not just responding to food anymore. They were responding to the crowd. The presence of other bodies had become part of the behavior itself. And the more the crowding increased, the more the colony lost its ability to use the space rationally. There was food in the paradise, but the paradise was no longer working. Then came the failure of the mothers. This was the darkest part. In normal conditions, mouse mothers protect their young inside nests. But in Universe 25, the nests were under constant pressure. Males entered spaces they should not enter. Other mice disturbed the nesting areas. Dominant males became exhausted from defending territory. And mothers were forced to do too much at once. They had to nurse, they had to protect, they had to move their young, they had to respond to intrusions over and over again. Eventually, many of them failed. Some abandoned their pups, some moved them and lost them, some attacked them. Some no longer seemed to respond to them as their own offspring. In parts of the enclosure, infant survival collapsed. Many pups never reached maturity. The colony was still full of life, but the chain that allows one generation to become the next was breaking. That is the part people often miss. A society does not die only when bodies die. It can begin dying when care stops moving forward. The pups that survived grew up inside a world where normal behavior had already collapsed. They did not see stable parenting. They did not see functioning social roles. They did not see normal courtship, normal defense, normal cooperation, or normal territory. They inherited a world with food, water, and shelter. But they did not inherit a society. And when they became adults, they were unlike the mice before them. The males of this later generation did not fight for status. They did not court females. They did not try to reproduce. They did not participate in the social life of the colony. They ate, they slept, they groomed. Again and again, they cleaned themselves. Their fur looked smooth. Their bodies looked healthy. They were not covered in wounds because they avoided conflict entirely. From a distance, they looked like the best animals in the enclosure. Calhoun called them the beautiful ones. But the name was almost horrifying, because their beauty was a sign of absence. They looked untouched because they had stopped touching the world. They were alive, but they had withdrawn from the basic behaviors that keep a species going. They did not mate. They did not compete. They did not raise young. They did not build anything socially. They moved through Universe 25 as if the rest of the colony had become irrelevant. And this is where the experiment becomes more than a story about overcrowding. The beautiful ones were not starving. They were not weak. They were not physically ruined. They were animals raised in a world where every meaningful role seemed already occupied, impossible or broken. So they chose no role at all. By day 560, the population reached its highest point. Around 2,200 mice lived inside Universe 25. That was the peak. After that, the number never rose again. Births slowed. Then they became rare, then they stopped. The last successful conception happened long before the last mouse died. That means the colony was doomed while it still looked alive. For a long time, Universe 25 continued as a kind of ghost society. Food still arrived, water still flowed, the apartments still stood, the beautiful ones still groomed themselves. The isolated females remained above the chaos. Random violence continued below, but the future was gone. One by one, the older mice died, and no new generation replaced them. In 1973, the final mouse in Universe 25 died. The experiment had lasted less than 5 years. A world created as a paradise had ended in extinction. Calhoun later described the collapse in a way that people never forgot. The body died at the end, but something else had died first. The social spirit of the colony had disappeared long before the last animal stopped breathing. When people heard about Universe 25, they immediately turned it into a warning. They said modern society was becoming too comfortable. They said cities were unnatural. They said abundance was dangerous. They said life without struggle produces decay. The image was too powerful to ignore. Perfect-looking mice, grooming themselves quietly while their entire world disappeared. It became a metaphor for everything people feared. Crowded cities, modern loneliness, consumer life, declining families, loss of purpose, cultural collapse. Everyone found their own meaning in the mice. But here is what most people miss. Calhoun's real conclusion was not simply that comfort kills. If comfort alone killed them, the first generation would have failed immediately. But they did not. The colony grew because the environment supported life. Food and water worked. Shelter worked. Safety worked. The collapse began when the population outgrew the number of meaningful social roles available inside the system. There were too many mice and too few stable places to become someone. Too few territories. Too few functioning family structures. Too few ways for young animals to enter adult life. Too few paths that made behavior useful. The problem was not that life became easy. The problem was that life became socially meaningless for too many of them. The fighters had no real victory to win. The rejected males had nowhere to go. The mothers had nests that could not be protected. The young had no functioning world to inherit. The beautiful ones had bodies but no role. The food never disappeared. The water never disappeared. What disappeared was the structure that told each mouse where it belonged, and that is far more unsettling, because it means a society can have resources and still fail. It can have comfort and still become unbearable. It can keep bodies alive while destroying the reasons those bodies know what to do. But the final twist is that Calhoun was not simply predicting doom. He did not spend the rest of his career saying collapse was unavoidable. He kept experimenting. He kept changing designs. He kept asking whether a crowded world could still function if it created new kinds of roles, new spaces, and new ways to participate. He believed the lesson was not that paradise must fail. The lesson was that paradise is not enough. A living society needs more than survival. It needs purpose. It needs movement. It needs roles that can be entered. It needs ways for the young to become necessary. It needs a future that feels open. Calhoun thought humans had something mice did not. We can invent new kinds of space, not just physical space, mental space, creative space, social space, places made of ideas, work, relationships, art, science, stories, and responsibility. He believed that when physical room becomes limited, human beings can expand into what he called conceptual space, a complicated phrase for a very simple hope. We can create new reasons to exist. That is why Universe 25 is still so disturbing. Not because it proves humans are mice. We are not. Not because it proves cities will collapse. It does not. Not because it proves comfort is evil. That is too simple. It is disturbing because it shows that survival alone is not the same as life. A society can feed everyone and still fail to give people a place. A world can remove danger and still produce emptiness. A paradise can become a cage if nothing inside it asks you to matter. The mice had no way to rewrite their world. They could not open the walls. They could not invent new roles. They could not build another kind of society. But humans can. And maybe that is the real question. Universe 25 leaves behind. Not whether comfort destroys us. Not whether abundance makes us weak. But whether we can keep creating meaningful places for each other before the walls start to feel closed. The mice were trapped inside their universe. We are still building ours. And what happens next is still a choice.